The NHL trade deadline is still more than 2 months away, but that doesn't mean we can't start looking ahead and being prepared for what's to come.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. My name is Nick Zararis. I am very glad that you've chosen to join the show on this day. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's show is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So, on today's show, I'm going to start putting together what we would call a preferred scouting list. And the way this works is, in real life, NHL teams, they have meetings throughout the early months of the season where they start to identify skill sets they're interested in, what they feel like their team might be missing. And based off of that, they start to send professional scouts out on assignment to look at certain players in person, to crunch tape for specific players. And then as you start to get closer to the trade deadline, you'll start to identify specific players you feel that meet the skill sets you're looking for. And then based on that and who's available, you can start to put together a plan of action for the trade deadline. You know, sometimes teams put that work in earlier and they start to facilitate said trades earlier in the season. You know, you think about Vancouver last year acquiring Elias Lindholm from the Calgary Flames. That's an example of a situation where the Canucks very early on in the season identified that they needed another center, another top six forward to add to their group. And because of that, they were ready to make that move in February as opposed to on deadline day. So it's real simple. Forwards, defense, and yes, we'll talk a little goaltending as well. But at the outset, we all know the Oilers' bigger need is defense. You could make an argument to me that maybe they need a better backup goalie than Calvin Pickard just in case. And we'll talk about that in the third segment of today's show. The argument for why it might not be the worst thing in the world to burn assets on an extra goalie just in case because of the nature of the NHL postseason. But at the outset, coming into this season, this defensive group felt a player light. And there is a strong correlation. And I want to do some statistical research on this because I know it's true for Florida last year. I know it's true for Vegas the year before. And I'm pretty sure it's relatively true for Colorado the year before. But there is a strong pattern of having very established hundreds of NHL games, defensemen in their late 20s, early 30s, and winning the Stanley Cup. It is very infrequent for a Stanley Cup winner to feature young defensemen. And that's partly because of the nature of how defensemen are developed. We typically would say they develop slower than forwards, their workload, their responsibility. It's a bit more challenging. So we typically see a correlation between experience and playoff results, especially on the back end. And Florida is a great example of that last year. You know, every single one of those guys on the older end of things, you think about Nico Mikkola, you think about Aaron Ekblad, Brandon Montour, Gus Forsling, etc. You keep going on and on. Dmitry Kulikov. You run through that list of guys, and you compare that to where the Oilers are at. And look, I am not here to say Bouchard being as young as he is disqualifying from him being an effective hockey player. I'm just telling you that history says this position group is typically older for a Stanley Cup winner. And then you compare that to Stetcher, to Emberson, who don't have a lot of experience. They are older, but they don't have a lot of games played. Ty Emberson has never played in an NHL playoff game. Stetcher has a handful of NHL playoff games. Sure, Nurse and Ekholm, they meet the requirements for sure. Late 20s, lots of playoff games already. Those guys have been through the wars. Bouchard, he's got 3-4 playoff runs under his belt now. You feel a little bit better about him, even though, you know, he's not the most physical, most rugged guy. But that bottom grouping, and we can put Brett Kulak in the group with Nurse and Ekholm as well. Brett Kulak's played a lot of playoff games over the years in Edmonton, the one playoff run in Montreal where they went to the Cup final. But this group would benefit immensely from adding one more defenseman to this group. And look, I know a lot of people would say, well, Nick, aren't you feeling good about the defense the last few weeks? Why would you want to change something that's fundamentally been working? And I agree with you. I understand on principle why you wouldn't want to change things up. You know, you're getting good play from Kulak, from Stetcher, from Emberson, but that's part of the reason why, and why I strongly feel that it would greatly benefit the Oilers to try and facilitate getting this trade for another defenseman done sooner rather than later. And there's not a correlation between better acclimation, success of a deadline or pre-deadline acquisition, and team success. But fundamentally, if you think about it, it just makes more sense. You know, if you can swing this trade in early February and give your guy an extra 8 to 10 games to get situated, to figure out his partner, how they're going to play, if he's a special teams guy, how he needs to fit into the penalty kill or the power play. And this will finally bring us to what you're probably watching the video for, the candidates. You know, there are always going to be players on pending free agent contracts that losing teams are going to be willing to part with. You know, Ivan Provorov is probably the best name, or biggest name, I should say, that's available as far as a defenseman. He is left-handed, which may prove to be an issue for the Oilers, being that they need help on that right side, unless you were to play him on the right, or play Nurse on the right, or play Kulak on the right, I suppose. But Provorov is really the only one of these guys that fits the mold of being a top 4 guy that's actually available to the Oilers. Like, I'm sure there are people listening to this who are saying, well, Nick, you've mentioned Rasmus Anderson of the Calgary Flames more than once over the last few months as far as someone who could be available come the NHL trade deadline. And look, I think the Flames are not a serious playoff team. I don't think they're going to be able to sustain the strong start they had and hang around in the playoff picture. They just don't have the horses. But I don't see a world where the Oilers and Flames would be able to commiserate a trade, because that hockey is weird about the rivalry thing. And look, I'm not saying rivalries don't matter. I'm not saying don't hold out for more if you're the Flames, just because that's what you're supposed to do. But I do think pride gets in the way at points, because Rasmus Anderson is exactly like, you could not draw up what the Flames need more than Rasmus Anderson, as far as if I could drop anyone who's available as far as being a pending free agent onto this Oilers team, because strong skater, kills penalties, can run a second power play, mobile, really solid in terms of moving the puck, and something that would really complement what Darnell Nurse does well. So with Rasmus Anderson not in the picture, you have the obvious. You have Ivan Provorov. The next best player is probably Marcus Peterson of the Pittsburgh Penguins, but the Penguins being back in the playoff mix might preclude them from selling. And that's why it's hard to make these trades early as you would probably want to, because some of these teams, you know, they're not going to say they're out of it until the last possible minute. Other candidates, Bowen Byram, who's over in Buffalo now, hasn't really fit well there, doesn't really fit what they do. Again, the problem, he's another lefty. Mike Matheson, another lefty. Oli Mata, and then Jeff Petrie I threw on the list as well. Petrie, a little bit older, still mobile, not that physical. Oli Mata, physical, not that mobile. All of these guys have obvious drawbacks or holes in their game, but I feel personally that the Oilers need another guy because of the benefits it's going to have for your lineup down the line. And what I mean by that, you're going to go through probably 8 or 9 defensemen on the way to a Stanley Cup. You know, you're going to get an injury, or you're going to have a player really struggling, and having somebody like Troy Stetcher as your first guy into the lineup, as opposed to Joshua Brown, that's going to help your team out a lot. You know, you want to have the fall off from the 6th defenseman to the 7th defenseman be as minimal as possible. And this is a luxury to have somebody like Stetcher or Emerson as the first guy out of the lineup, because that tells me you have a little bit of depth, and depth matters a lot when it comes to the postseason. And that'll be a natural transition as we pivot to talking about forwards in the next segment. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Today's episode is sponsored by PrizePicks. If you love sports, you're going to love PrizePicks, the best place to turn your sports knowledge into real money. Whether it's hockey, football, or any of your other favorite sports, PrizePicks makes it easy to get in on the action. You can now win up to 1,000 times your money on PrizePicks. Plus, this holiday season, they're giving away $30 million in rewards during Picksmas and offering 2 free picks in December. And when your picks hits, PrizePicks makes it easy to cash out. You can get your money in as quick as 15 minutes. If you were interested, you could go over and look at the NHL board. There's a few games tonight on Friday. You've got the Hurricanes and the Devils. You could do something like Jack Hughes over goals 0.5. You could do something like Andrei Svechnikov over 3.5 shots on goal for the Hurricanes. All of that is over at PrizePicks. So download the app today, and maybe you cash out and have a little bit of fun with your friends. Cash out fast. Download the app today. Use code LOCKEDONNHL and get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's right, $50 instantly. PrizePicks. Run your game. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers as we are all enjoying this holiday week. Let me tell you, folks, I've had a lot of cookies this week. And look, I work out a lot. I run. I take my health relatively seriously. But man, the holidays, if there's cookies, there's brownies, there's cake, there's pie, it's dangerous. Why was I eating gingerbread cookies at like 12:30 last night when I got home from WWE? Because they were there. You know, you don't just have gingerbread cookies laying around the middle of the summer. The holidays are tough, but man, that sweet tooth calls sometimes. It's like the Green Goblin mask. All right. Speaking of the Green Goblin mask and being called to, the Oilers don't really have a spot to bring another forward into this group. We are all expecting Evander Kane to be in the mix at some point later this season, whether that's February, whether that's March, whether that's at the start of the playoffs. But if you are expecting Evander Kane to play this year, as Stan Bowman is, because of what he had said in an interview at the end of November, that Evander still wasn't really at the pre-testing stage of his recovery where the Oilers could put together a regimen for him and see where he was at, what he needed, that type of thing. There's a fundamental misunderstanding at times. I am not saying the Oilers should be looking at more forwards because they need one. If anything, the Oilers should be looking at forwards in hopes of bolstering this group in the hopes you don't need one. Because I said this the other day on the Christmas episode where we were talking about things we would give Corey Perry and Derek Ryan. A reduced workload would do wonders for those guys. At their ages, their respective ages, I don't think Derek Ryan or Corey Perry are an every game player. I don't think you want to drop those guys into a best of 7 and expect them to play every day, because that fall off, that ability to refill that tank in terms of recovery at that age, it's challenging. And the opportunity to drop a Corey Perry in for like 2 games in a 7-game series, or Derek Ryan in a 2 games in a best of 7 series, that's going to do a lot more for their games than maybe you would think, because I don't think the Oilers are shopping for a top 6 forward. You know, the market is very light this year as far as forwards, unless some teams, you know, like the Rangers or the Islanders, maybe concede their positions. If the Oilers and the Islanders and the Rangers are going to push, they're going to try and keep their guys and go for the playoffs, then I think the market dries up a lot. But if those 2 teams are willing to concede that they're probably not making the playoffs, or if they do, they're going to be early exits. You know, the Islanders, you have Brock Nelson, you have Kyle Palmieri. If you're looking at the Rangers, you have Riley Smith, you have Chris Kreider. You know, those are real bona fide options to reinforce a top 6. And I don't think the Oilers would be looking at that type of guy. You know, I think Palmieri on the Oilers' 3rd line would be great. That's the type of overkill offense you would love to have. I don't necessarily know about Palmieri's speed, but you get him and Adam Henrique back together from their Devil days more than a decade ago at this point. But those 2 have chemistry, and there is something to be said for taking the board for what it's worth. And I said this a lot on yesterday's show, and it's been a recurring theme I've said a lot on the show this season. The board is never going to be easier. It is you and Vegas for the best 2 teams in the Western Conference. It is just Florida and maybe the Devils, if you're ready to believe in them, in the East. The Oilers, I think, are better than Vegas. I think the Oilers are better than the Devils. I don't know if the Oilers are better than the Panthers. I think the Oilers can beat the Panthers. but I don't know if they can beat them 4 times in 7 tries yet. And you think about what that series came down to last year. It was depth, it was defense, and the Oilers, in bolstering their group, getting another forward in there. And that's where, the name Taylor Hall comes to mind. You could come full circle, bring him back. You could do something like Yanni Gourde and then really have versatility as far as center-handedness. You could get Yanni Gourde in the mix. You could move someone like Henrique out to the wing. You could push Janmark or Connor Brown down to the 4th line and push Perry or Ryan up into the press box and really elongate your lineup. Because, like exactly what we said as far as the defensemen a few minutes ago, if you can get those guys, the fringe parts of your lineup, into depth roles, and then what guys who are in your depth roles are in a consideration, that tells me you have a really deep team. And that is a luxury in the postseason. You cannot afford to have missed opportunities when it comes to the playoffs. And that'll be the framing for the final conversation when we make the argument maybe as to why you would look at a goalie. But the forward class is not really that exciting. Taylor Hall, Yanni Gourde, Brock Nelson, Kyle Palmieri, maybe Jason Zucker if you're really desperate. Riley Smith, I mentioned. I suppose I would be remiss if I didn't mention Brock Besser, but the Canucks are going to try and make the playoffs this year. And I don't think they would trade him to the Oilers. It's not out of the realm of possibility, but that would likely be a big trade. That would be multiple pieces going back and forth in both directions. And I don't think the Oilers have a big appetite to wholesale alter their lineup. I think they value the continuity they've established with the guys who have held over from last year. And look, you lost a lot of guys in one offseason. You lost Fogle, you lost McLeod, you lost Holloway, you lost CC, you lost Broberg. You lose 5 out of 18 guys in one offseason from a Stanley Cup team that went to 7 games. That's challenging to overcome. It's one of the driving forces for why the team struggled that first month of the season, because there just wasn't continuity, especially in things like the penalty kill and the power play, which were a little bit off on both counts. Once they started to ramp it up, you started to get a vision, and now obviously they've played great hockey over the last month or so, and I would love to see the Oilers find a way to send Evander Kane out and use that money to acquire another forward, whether it be Yanni Gourde, whether it be Taylor Hall, if it's somebody like Tyler Bertuzzi, just a little versatility. And that's not necessarily me saying I don't think Evander Kane is good. It's that I think Evander Kane at this point, you don't know what you're going to get. And we know those types of major injuries where you're talking about a back surgery, a hip surgery, that really takes a while to come back from. And if Evander Kane had surgery in October and he was still in the early stages of recovery, hadn't started doing rehab yet because he hadn't even done the testing to really see how the surgery had settled, that tells me his ramp up is going to be a little hectic. That tells me he's probably going to have a very short window of time to get himself up to game speed. And it's just a lot to ask of a guy to say, we know you haven't played all year. You have 12 regular season games, and then we're in the playoffs, and you need to be as good as you can be. That's just a lot to ask. And that me saying send him out and bring someone else in, it's not necessarily I don't think Evander Kane can be effective again. It's just it is a very tall ask for somebody who hasn't played competitive hockey since last May to get 10 regular season games and then just get dropped into the lineup. Victor Arvidsson did it last year for the Kings. He only played 15 regular season games before playing in the postseason. But the role of Evander Kane is going to play on this team is also a point of contention. Is he going to slide in with Leon? Is he going to slide in with Connor? Is he going to play on the third line? Who's going down from the third line to the fourth line? Who's coming out of the lineup? There's a whole lot to consider at play here. And frankly, I'm very curious to see how the Oilers choose to navigate the Evander Kane thing, because I really don't know, because we don't know where his recovery is at. And until we have a better idea of how his recovery is going and his timeline, it's not really something the Oilers are in a position to account for or prepare for, because there's a world where he's ready mid-February. There's a world where he's not ready until day one of the playoffs. And look, there's no salary cap in the playoffs, so I suppose you could drop him in spite of whatever additions you make at the deadline, and you could make the numbers work. But sitting here right now, it feels very hard to believe someone that hasn't played since last May is going to be able to ramp themselves up into great form in a short window to be ready for the playoffs. The playoffs are a very draining and a very challenging proposition for a lot of different reasons. And I struggle. I really just think it's a difficult ask. You think about what the Rangers did last year, where Blake Wheeler broke his leg in February. And for some reason, he played 6 minutes in a game in the Eastern Conference Finals against the Panthers. He was not fully healthy. He was not fully ramped up, but he wanted to play. And that's something the Oilers are going to have to consider as well here as far as Evander Kane, who might end up being their deadline addition forward. We're going to take one more break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, make a quick argument as far as adding another goalie. Be right back. In today's world, where we all have so many subscriptions for so many different things, you can lose track of them. I had a few subscriptions that I didn't even realize I was still paying for, and today's sponsor, Rocket Money, made it so easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps you find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved over $5 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. For me, the subscription tracker is great. I forgot I was subscribed to a few things, and I saved a ton. Plus, with the goals feature, Rocket Money makes it easy to set money aside for the future. No more stressing about budgeting. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. rocketmoney.com/locked-on. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, the Friday of a holiday weekend, sandwiched between two holidays. I'm looking forward to some R&R. The holidays are tiring, man. You're running around, you're doing a lot of things, you're busy. It wears down on you. Still going to try and get a run in, still going to try and get in a lift. I do want to see the Timothy Chalamet, Bob Dylan movie too. Got priorities, got to see Nosferatu. There's a lot going on this week, but I'm very glad I get to do this show as an outlet for some of my energy because, man, you're driving 40 minutes at a time. You got a lot of thoughts in your head. You start zoning out while people are talking in the living room, and you start thinking about, well, what do the Oilers need? How far away are they from doing this? And maybe that's just a me thing. Maybe I'm the one zoning out thinking about the trade deadline in December, but the Oilers do not need a third goalie. A third goalie is a supreme luxury. It is not something most teams budget for, and it's not something most teams are going to account for. The argument for adding a veteran goalie is very straightforward. We have seen two different iterations of the Colorado Avalanche before they eventually went on to win the Stanley Cup be derailed by their starting goalie getting injured in the postseason. Pavel Francois was a very big drop-off from their previous starter. And you think about it in relation to some of the other teams we've seen, Dallas with Khudobin getting to the Cup final in 2020. That's a team that was down to a third goalie because of the injury situation they were dealing with. And I don't think the Oilers are good enough as a team around him that Calvin Pickard is capable of winning multiple playoff series. And look, the backup goalie thing, it's not a position anyone wants to find themselves in. It's like going into the playoffs with a backup quarterback. There's a reason only two backup quarterbacks have ever won the Super Bowl. Nick Foles and Jeff Hostetler, 2 times in 50-something Super Bowls. It does not happen all that often. And in hockey, it's even more challenging because a lot of the time you're getting pulled into a game as an injury replacement on the fly, and you have to psych yourself up. You have to ramp yourself up. And I just struggle to think that you would feel comfortable if you're the Oilers with Calvin Pickard having to start multiple playoff games in a row in multiple playoff series. You were able to win one Calvin Pickard start against the Canucks last year in the second round, and that was a really good performance. It gave the Oilers a chance to reset Stuart Skinner, to give him an opportunity to get out of his head, to breathe, and to start to find his game again. And ideally, if you're going to add a third goalie, there's only one person that really comes to mind, and that's Jonathan Quick. With the Rangers being such a disappointment this year, Jonathan Quick, if he, I suppose, wanted to try and win another Stanley Cup, and I think this one is a real long shot because Jonathan Quick is from Connecticut. He's playing for his childhood favorite team and really has settled in to what the next phase of his life is going to be, being close to family, being back on the East Coast after spending pretty much his entire professional life in Los Angeles, stopover in Vegas 2 years ago. But I don't think there's a world where you're going to get Jonathan Quick to leave the Rangers, even if the team is bad the way it is. And it's unfortunate because I think Jonathan Quick would be perfect in a tandem with Stuart Skinner, especially for the way that Quick has played over the last 2 years, the type of experience he has. And frankly, if you have Stuart Skinner injured, you feel okay with Jonathan Quick for a few games. He has shown over the last year and a half last season and so far this year that he is capable of playing, 2 and 3 or 2 and 4. When Shesterkin was struggling last year, the goalie split, the workload split was a lot more even. It was closer to 50-50 than you would expect for a 38-year-old and a bell cow who won the Vezina 2 years ago. But all of that said, goaltender, luxury. Forward, luxury. Defenseman is a necessity. It's not a question that the Oilers need another defenseman. It's simply a matter of what traits do they want, how expensive is it going to be to get, and can we make the money work? That's all the Oilers really need to be considering. I would love to add another forward. I would love to add a third goalie. I think you can never have too much depth. It is simply a matter of, can you make all of the pieces fit? It is expensive to add at the deadline. In terms of capital, you're going to be burning assets, whether it's draft picks or prospects, and we know the Oilers haven't picked a lot over the last handful of years because they've been making deadline rentals. They haven't picked in the first round. They had to trade up to get into the first round this past draft in June because of the fact they burned their first round pick in getting Adam Henrique and Sam Carrick last year. But all of this is to say, there is a lot of turbulent ground still to come. We need more teams to effectively eliminate themselves from playoff contention before we can all start talking about looting them for more players, getting players from those teams onto our teams. That's just the nature of the beast and why it's so challenging to acquire players in season early, because teams don't want to admit they're out of it. If you're the Ducks right now, you're struggling to get people in your building. If you are a team that is middling or bad, it is hard to get people to come to your games to begin with. And then you start selling off players, especially notable players or quality players, they are going to stop showing up. That's part of why I think the Islanders are going to be very reticent to trade Brock Nelson or Kyle Palmieri, even though it would make perfect sense. If you're going to finish 6th in the Metro and you're going to lose those two guys for nothing, why wouldn't you get some picks back? Why wouldn't you try and get some prospects back and at least give yourself something for that? If you're going to take it on the chin, you're going to get kicked in the teeth as a middling or bad team, set yourself up so that the work isn't as drastic. I will never understand people or front offices that ride guys through the end, even though you could get some surplus value back. The 15 post-trade deadline games you're going to get from Brock Nelson are not more valuable than what you could do with draft picks. Like, even if the Islanders got, a second, a fifth, and a middling prospect for Brock Nelson, they could still do stuff with those picks. You don't have to use those picks if you don't want to. You could try and turn those into a different player. And that's really the argument for liquidating if you're on the fence or if you're a poor team. But that will just about do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell. We have doubled the subscriber count of the YouTube channel since I took over back in April. Just want to say to everybody out there, thank you, appreciate you, glad you're on the journey. We are making progress. I'm very excited to see what next week and the new year holds for the Oilers, for the show. I will talk to you guys on Monday. Everyone have a safe and fun weekend. I will see you guys then.